start recording. And then I'm going to start our live on Facebook recording. So give me 1 minute and we'll starting that. Oops. I might have put myself in the wrong place, but I'll try to fix it in just a minute.
It says the meeting is now streaming live on Facebook.
Okay, great, but it might be under mine and not under Mukai. Okay. So let's see, I'm going to stop that. Here we go. I might have put myself in the wrong place, but I'll try to fix it in just a minute. Oh, and then
the meeting is now streaming live on Facebook.
And we're going to have some feedback. Great, so I'm going to introduce
and not under Mukai.
Rita Brogan, and then go on mute.
I'm going to stop that. Here we go. I might have put myself in the wrong place, but I'll try to fix it in just a minute. Oh, and then the meeting is now streaming. Can I go? Hi, my name is Rita Brogan. I'm president of Friends of Mukai, and on behalf of I might have put myself in the wrong place, but I'll try to fix it in just a minute. Oh, and then the meeting is now.
Sorry. Go ahead.
All right, I'll start over again. Hello, my name is Rita Brogan. I am president of Friends of Mukai and want to welcome you on behalf of Mukai Farm Gardens. I'm thrilled to introduce our topic and speakers for this evening's 80th anniversary commemoration of the signing of Executive Order 9066. Mukai Farm Gardens exists today because the Vashon community rallied to restore and resurrect what is now the only pre-World War II Japanese-American farm complex standing in America today. And that is why one of the central elements of Mukai's mission is to advance understanding of the Japanese-American experience by telling the stories of the people whose lives were cruelly and unjustly interrupted when they were expelled from the West Coast zone of exclusion to concentration camps in remote and desolate areas. And the mythology is that all Japanese Americans complied peacefully and without incident. The truth is otherwise, and our speakers today will share with us the story that they have documented in their recently published graphic novel, We Hereby Refuse. And I'm particularly thrilled that those speakers are Tamiko, Nimura, and Frank Abe. I met Tamiko fairly recently when I learned of the important research she conducted several years ago about Japanese American farms on Vashon. Tamiko is an award-winning creative nonfiction writer, community journalist, editor, educator with experience in higher education, arts, public history. She's author of the book Rosa Franklin, A Life in Healthcare, Public Service, and Social Justice. And it is also my pleasure to introduce Tamiko's co-author and my old and dear friend, Frank Abe. We both started our careers in journalism and in Asian American activism many decades ago. And after a successful media career, Frank produced acclaimed literary and film works on the resistance to Japanese American incarceration. He received an American Book Award for John Okada, the life and rediscovered work of the author of No Boy, and made an award-winning PBS documentary called Conscience and the Constitution on the largest organized resistance to the incarceration of Japanese Americans. And his latest collaboration with Tamiko Nimura is We Hereby Refuse. And without further delay, I would like to turn the screen over to Tamiko Nimura.
Thank you, Rita, and thank you, Tina, for having us. I'm just so thrilled to be here with all of you. Let me bring up my screen. And someone can unmute and tell me if I'm not making that work, but okay, great. I am so especially happy to be here with you all. I'm honored to be here with Frank, one of the organizers of the very first Day of Remembrance, which hopefully we can talk about later. and to be with the community on Vashon Island. I feel very connected to Vashon in a few ways, though I live in Tacoma now. We are here to talk about remembrance and resistance, and in part, our graphic novel, We Hereby Refuse, Japanese American Resistance to Wartime Incarceration. The book came out in May 2021, and it was commissioned by the Wing Luke Museum in Seattle and published by Chin Music Press, also of Seattle. The illustrations were done by artist Ross Ishikawa and Matt Sasaki. So I'm going to talk a bit about the graphic novel first, then trace the journey of Japanese Americans from Vashon Island through the first few stages of their incarceration. I am just so honored to mention that I'll be talking about the journey of the Matsuda family, and I understand that Miyoko-san is here, and Martha, I believe. So I'll be talking a bit about Mary Matsuda as well. After that, Frank will take it up from there and show a later stage of the incarceration, including Japanese American resistance, and then I'll come back briefly at the end. So out of the many figures that we could have chosen to focus on, we focused on 3 young second-generation Japanese Americans, Nisei, born here, all American citizens. We start on the left here with Jim Akutsu of Seattle, who resisted the draft from Minidoka and who's widely considered as the inspiration for John Okada's novel, No No Boy. Our second figure is Hiroshi Kashiwagi, a young man who refused to sign a loyalty questionnaire and later renounced his American citizenship under family pressure. Kashiwagi was also my uncle. And third, we have Mitsuye Endo, who was a typist working for the state of California. While imprisoned at Topaz, she refused the government offer of a plea bargain and remained behind barbed wire for another 18 months or so. She and her attorney, James Purcell, took her case all the way to the Supreme Court, one of 4 cases contesting the Japanese American incarceration. Taken together, the 3 characters give us very different portraits of what it means to resist and the complex decisions behind doing so. But we've always said that these are human beings making human decisions. Now, on this next slide, I'm going to tie our book with Vashon Island. We have Hiroshi Kashiwagi again on the right in 2013 with Mary Matsuda Grunwald from Vashon Island. And there's quite a story behind this picture that I'm going to return to near the end of our presentation. So Rita mentioned a few years ago that my colleague Vince Whiteweiler and I did a deep dive research project about Japanese American farms and farming on Vashon. And honestly, I will never see the island the same way again. We found, though many of you, like Rita, might know this already, that Japanese immigrants arrived as early as 1900 when they first appeared on the Vashon census. They helped with the clear cutting of the land. They began farming, cultivating crops like strawberries, loganberries, and currants. There was also some poultry farming. As far as we know, there were up to 35 Japanese American operated farms on Vashon by the 1930s. Now, Japanese immigrants were not permitted to become citizens or own land due to legal restrictions on immigration and land ownership, which was targeted at Japanese immigrants. And in the 1920s and 30s, we found that the community was a small but close-knit one, and they gathered for things like picnics and dances and funerals. They put on performances for the island community, and some farmers even donated cherry trees to community spaces. And on the left here, you can see that there's a picture of them gathered for a funeral at the Island Club, and it was a clubhouse that's no longer there, but the Island Club was at the site of what is now Ober Park. And so one of these families was the Matsuda family. The parents were Heisuke and Mitsuno, and they immigrated from Japan, and they first lived in Seattle and Fife, and their children were Yoneichi and Mary. They operated a 10-acre farm meant to be held in trust for Yoneichi, their American-born son, and they raised loganberries and strawberries. Mary is the young woman at the center of the slide here, and she was the woman with my uncle Hiroshi a few slides back. Mary was 17 when the war broke out. So we're going to follow her journey for a bit through the early stages of her incarceration, along with the other Vashon Japanese Americans. 80 years ago, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the military to forcibly remove Japanese Americans from the West Coast. The Matsuda family gathered that night at dinner, and her mother noted that there were now some restrictions on their freedom. There was a curfew, for example, and other kinds of restrictions about movement. And Mary tells much of her story in her 2005 memoir, Looking Like the Enemy. Just a couple months later, on April 24th, 1942, the civilian exclusion orders were posted in Seattle and shortly thereafter on Vashon. Like thousands of other Japanese Americans on the West Coast, the Vashon Japanese American community was ordered to report to one central kind of place. On Vashon, they were reported to report to the Island Club, ironically, because they had so many social gatherings there. And in just a few days, sometimes not even a week, they had to dispose of their belongings, their pets, their property, packing only what they could carry. And there's a panel here from a graphic novel showing what some of that looked like in Seattle. On May 16th, 1942, the Vashon Japanese Americans left their homes, carrying their belongings to their registration point at the Island Club. And Rita, you wrote about this as well for the North American Post in 2021. The Matsuda family carried what they could, and they walked about a mile from their farm. The Matsuda farm, Vashon folks might know, is that it's just a short walk across the fields from the Mukai house over to the Island Club. It was harvest time, and many of the Vashon farmers would have been leaving behind fields and rows of berries and fruit that they were unable to harvest. When the Matsudas arrived at the Island Club, along with the other 111 Japanese Americans, they were greeted by armed military with guns and bayonets, and they loaded their belongings onto covered military trucks like the one shown up here on the left. They were given tags to put on to their clothes, again, similar to the Bainbridge Island Japanese here. From there, they went to the Vashon Heights ferry dock, which is no longer there, but there was a special military ferry close to, I believe, 300 islanders were there to see their Japanese neighbors leave. And Mary remembers one of her friends approaching them. She remembers passing familiar landmarks. I don't know if the alibi is still there, but it seemed to have been a quite familiar landmark. There's the hardware store that she mentions on the right here. And Mary remembers one of her friends approaching them and talking to her and saying, "Why is this happening?" And she remembers watching as the ferry pulled away, and that one of her friends just kept waving and waving until she couldn't see them anymore. From there, the Vashon folks went to Pier 52 in Seattle. And they had gone from actually to Kingston first, and then they went to Pier 52 in Seattle. And Mary remembers quite another group waiting for the Japanese to arrive there. And this one was much less friendly. She says here on the right, one ruddy-faced, tall, heavy-set man lifted his gun with one hand and shook his clenched fist with the other. "Get out of here, you goddamn Japs," he shouted. "I ought to blast your heads off." From the ferry and Pier 52, the Islanders were then marched to King Street Station. We have that panel from King Street Station in our graphic novel, A Few, and they were escorted onto a train, and the guards pulled the shades down, and they had no idea, the Japanese Americans, where they were going. After a couple of days in the train, the Vashon folks arrived at Pinedale, about 8 miles north of Fresno, California. This is also where folks from Tacoma, where I live, were being relocated as well. Pinedale was one of a few assembly centers, basically temporary detention facilities. There are other assembly centers like Camp Harmony in Puyallup, where the Seattle Japanese American folks went. Like other assembly centers, Pinedale was surrounded by chain link fences, which were topped with barbed wire. They were pointed, the barbed wire was pointed inwards. There were guard towers and hastily constructed, poorly insulated barracks. From there, they were there for a couple of months, and here, Mary and the Vashon folks spent about 6 weeks before they were forcibly relocated yet again by train to a larger concentration camp in Northern California, a place called Tule Lake. And this is where my uncle Hiroshi Kashiwagi was being imprisoned. Frank will take up his story and tell it with scenes from the graphic novel.
Oh, that's my cue, I guess. Okay, wonderful.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Tamiko.
Oops.
Okay, and we'll come back to the story of Mary Matsuda's family after my little bit here. But from here, the story of the Islanders from Vashon takes a much darker turn. We call this the story of camp as you've never seen it before, because it's the part of the story that Japanese Americans just don't like to talk about. For decades, our community has turned away from this story, averted our eyes. Tulians would only talk about it when pressed. And that's because this is where the community becomes deeply divided in its response to incarceration. So I'm going to jump here and share this screen. So I'm going to pick up Tamiko's story with that of her uncle, Hiroshi Kashiwagi, who graciously allowed us to make him one of the main characters, one of the three main characters in the graphic novel. Hiroshi was just 2 years out of high school, helping his family sharecrop on a fruit ranch outside Sacramento, waiting to go to college, no different from any other idealistic American kid who was ready and willing to serve his country if called upon. He was removed first to the nearby Marysville Assembly Center. There were 16 of these, and then brought by train to Tule Lake on the California-Oregon border. And Tule Lake is one of 10 war relocation centers, and it's where, according to Rita, what Rita's told me, it's where all the Islanders were brought, from Pinedale Assembly Center, as Tamiko said, to Tule Lake. It wasn't long before the needs of two different agencies came together in a catastrophic bureaucratic bungle that divided Japanese America forever in all the 10 camps. First, as you probably know, many young Nisei men, wanted a way to prove that they were just as American as everyone else by volunteering for the army in the fight against fascism. And the community leaders, Japanese American Citizens League, or JACL, led the call for the army to admit the Nisei into the armed services. Now, the army, having effectively branded the Japanese in America as untrustworthy by the very fact of locking them up, now needed a reverse PR campaign to clear volunteers as eligible for service. By the same token, the mission of the Civilian War Relocation Authority was to eventually relocate families into homes off the West Coast and in the East and Midwest. And it too needed some way to clear them for resettlement. Families in Oberlin, Ohio, were wary of the government moving in these Japanese from these camps. I mean, after all, they were locked up for being potential spies and saboteurs, and East Coasters were wary of having these people come in. So they needed to cleanse them or clear them in some way. So Army, WRA come up with what for them was the perfect paper trail. And having worked in government for 25 years, I understand how these things work now. I mean, bureaucrats, they want to cover their ass, quite frankly, and document everything. So they created a paper trail, a loyalty oath, a loyalty questionnaire. And the Army and WRA combined their forms into their questions into one form. I guess I should explain. There's 26 innocent questions, your name, address. The question 27, you probably heard this before. Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? 28, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the U.S. from any and all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor? McCloy and Dylan Meyer believe these were who had a problem with these questions. Well, by this time, it's been 1 year into the war, 1 year into their imprisonment, and Hiroshi Kashiwagi and many others were just fed up with the government, fed up with JCL, fed up with continually demanding that they prove their loyalty, and he refuses the pressure to sign the loyalty oath, especially when no one, not even the camp administration, knew the consequences of a yes or no answer. As Hiroshi wrote in one of his plays, I'm sick of saying yes to everything. Yes, I'll go to camp. Yes, I'll serve in the army. Yes, I'll declare my loyalty. I'll prove my loyalty by standing for my rights as an American. So he holds fast and refuses to sign this doggone questionnaire. It was only under the threat of 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine, a penalty that in fact was invented on the spot by the administration officials, and in fact not actionable or enforceable, that Hiroshi decided, well, he was compelled to write down no on this questionnaire because the government needed, being a good bureaucracy, a binary yes or no answer, yes or no. Now, I want you to remember, these people have committed no acts of disloyalty. All they've done is put down answers under threat of prison time and stiff fines on a poorly understood questionnaire for which, again, no one has any idea of the consequences. And the consequence that was unknown at the time was that the WRA would take those forms, those 120,000 pieces of paper, and use them to sort people into two piles, yes and no. Congress pressures the WRA to segregate the no's from the yeses, right? And then JCL demands protection for their own loyalists who are getting beaten up in camp. So the WRA obliges all these pressures by fortifying Tule Lake as its segregation center. And it's unfortunate the Vashon residents were, moved to this particular camp. What are the chances? 1 out of 10. The government moves in the 12,000 people who had answered no on their questionnaires or refused to answer, 12,000 people from all the camps, and move them into Tule Lake, the people whose names were in the no pile. And they try to move out those who had answered yes, but only 6,000 move out because a lot of them just don't want to move. So the Tule Lake is a combination of those who were yes, yes, and no, no. And the WRA adds more watchtowers, a double man-proof fence, and builds a military stockade to hold inmate leaders on the right there. That means so we have a prison inside of a prison. So what makes this the story of camp as you've not seen it before is that we examine the shop-worn label of loyalty and turn it on its head. As several Tulians said at the time, it's not a question of our loyalty. It's the country that's not loyal to us, to its own principles, to not loyal to the Constitution. It's government expediency that creates a class of disloyals on paper through a purely bureaucratic act. It's only disloyalty on paper, not by action. Hiroshi Kashiwagi has not, planted any bombs anywhere, or passed any secrets to the emperor. And under the law, you can't be prosecuted for your thoughts, only for action. Also during this time, members of Congress have been trying to strip the Nisei of their U.S. citizenship while they're in camp. Congress is told that the 14th Amendment guarantees birthright citizenship under the Constitution to anyone born on U.S. soil. So July 44, Congress finds a workaround, passes the Denaturalization Act, which for the first time enables a U.S. citizen to voluntarily surrender their citizenship during time of war. And the beauty, if you will, of this idea is that, why pass a law that will be overturned as unconstitutional when you can get the angry, frustrated, and confused Nisei in camp to voluntarily renounce their citizenship? And in fact, many families walk into the trap, including the family of Hiroshi Kashiwagi. Hiroshi immediately regrets his decision, desperately tries to withdraw it, but he can't. So our story shows how this change from a relocation camp to segregation prison created the conditions for unrest at Tule Lake, where again, the Vashon residents were moved. Tule Lake was converted to a high security prison. And where you have a prison, you inevitably create prison gangs with pressures for repatriation to Japan, expatriation, denationalization, renunciation, and ultimately deportation. the 18,000 people who've been pushed into the segregation center can see how this government has completely abandoned them. They just left them there, or turned against them, if you will. All they have is literally their skin. All they have is their bodies, their Japanese ancestry. And that's all they have left to find strength and pride in themselves is their ancestry. So anger, frustration, and isolation boil over into organization. So these are the so-called pro-Japan fanatics at Tule Lake that you may have heard about, and which, again, my community didn't want to talk about. In our book, we try to show how these groups were the product of the duress of mass incarceration and imprisonment in the prison camp. After all, just stop and think about it. Was there a Back to Japan movement after Pearl Harbor and before the mass eviction from their homes? Oh, no. It was in this environment at Tule Lake, this pressure cooker, that 7 of every 10 Nisei at Tule Lake voluntarily surrendered their U.S. citizenship, including Hiroshi Kashiwagi. He caves to family pressure to renounce his U.S. citizenship. As one character says, how convenient for the government to give us this chance to self-deport. And we walked right into the trap. Into this turmoil walks an attorney from San Francisco named Wayne Collins. So Hiroshi and others recruit him to take on their renunciation cases. And he wins a stay of deportation for Hiroshi. And he advises the group that you can no more resign citizenship in time of war than you can resign from the human race. He points out that they renounced under the duress of 2 years of essentially false imprisonment and physical coercion from gangs in camp that the government knowingly allows to run wild with only rumor and misinformation to guide them. So on the spot, Collins scrawls out a sample letter to the Attorney General for Hiroshi and others to copy and pass around and start the process of withdrawing their renunciations. The war finally ends, and in 1946, right, like 6 months after VJ Day, Hiroshi returns to Sacramento on a bright sunny day, only to find that old friends from Tule Lake are ignoring and ostracizing him with the derogatory term of Nono Boy, a division in our community that exists to this day. And for 10 years after the war, 10 years until 1955, Wayne Collins single-handedly fights the Justice Department to restore the citizenship to Hiroshi and 5,000 others who had renounced. So Hiroshi was always grateful to Wayne Collins. He dedicated his memoirs to Collins, and that's where I will leave this part of the story. As I said, this is a darker story than you're accustomed to hearing. It's complex. It's a very complex one. And maybe you can see why former Tulians and Japanese Americans in general clam up when you ask them about it. But it's the story of Tule Lake. And it's a story of at least some of those who were expelled from Vashon Island. I'll have more to say about that later, but Tamiko will pick it up from here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Frank. Get from current slide. All right. After my uncle came back to Sacramento, he went to college at UCLA and then came back to Northern California. He married one of my dad's younger sisters, Sadako Nimura, and they had 3 sons. He became a librarian in San Francisco and built a large Japanese language collection of materials at the Western Edition branch. Even later, he became a poet, a playwright, an activist, and his favorite, an actor. But he always felt a sting of rejection when people winced at the name Tule Lake or the label Nono Boy. And I didn't quite realize just how much it affected him until I edited his first memoir, Swimming in the American, published in 2005. Now, 2005 was also the year that Mary Matsuda Grunwald published her memoir, Looking Like the Enemy. And when she was on book tour, she met my uncle Hiroshi and my auntie Sadako. Mary had left Vashon and gotten married and had 3 children. One of them are here with us today. She continued in healthcare and became a nurse with Group Health and established its advice nurse helpline. And now, because her brother Yoniichi had volunteered with the 442nd famous combat team which was one of the most decorated units in United States military combat history. Mary had always thought that she could not be anything but a yes, yes person. And for decades, she said she had never really thought about or taken the time to understand the no position. But she had written her book and she had met my uncle and auntie and she became friends with them. And she realized how much pain she had caused through judging and discriminating against no families. In 2006, Mary decided to attend a community pilgrimage to Tule Lake, and my uncle Hiroshi and his family were there as well. So here's a picture of Mary with my auntie and uncle and their two of their sons and family friend Linda Ando, who's standing there in the center. At the pilgrimage, and Martha can add more details, I believe she was there. At the pilgrimage, Mary publicly apologized at the site where both she and my uncle had been incarcerated. It was a really powerful moment, and I understand there were many tears from everyone. And she talks about this change of heart in her second memoir. It's a book of essays called Becoming Mama-san. I'm especially glad to be connected to Vashon through my work and the pre-war Japanese American community, but also personally through the rare and healing friendship between Mary and my family of yeses, yeses, and no nos. At the bottom of her account here on the slide, she says, I've come to realize that I've been wrong in my attitude towards those who answered no to the loyalty questionnaire. And I want to take responsibility for the pain I've caused them. And this is in 2013, right? She had, had really held that position for such a long time. So it's really quite rare and moving that she had that. And so I want to end here by thinking about honoring that spirit of remembrance, resilience, and resistance. And so I want to conclude a bit with the final page of the graphic novel. My uncle continued his activism with the redress movement in the 1980s and beyond, and we show him in the final pages of We Hereby Refuse, and he's demonstrating here at the Tule Lake Pilgrimage of 2018. Here's what we wrote as a sort of collective voice from the Japanese American community. The government was wrong to single us out for exclusion based solely on our race. It was wrong then, and it would be wrong now. And whenever we see America turn against a people because of their race or their religion or their whatever, we won't just stand by. We won't just go along. I will speak up. I will see that every person gets a fair hearing. I will be the friend we didn't have when we needed one the most. It happened to us. We refuse to let it happen again. On this day of remembrance and resistance, it's been a real honor to be here with you and all of our communities. Thank you so much for having us, and I'm going to turn it back to Rita to moderate questions, comments, and answers from you all.
Thank you, Tamiko. What I would like to do is spend some time thinking about the stories that you just told and ask Frank and Tamiko to share with us how this book came about. How did you come together to write this book?
Frank. Yes, Frank's been talking all day.
Tamiko, go ahead.
Okay, Frank's been talking all day, I'm sure. So the Wing Luke Museum in Seattle put out a call for writers and artists and writing a graphic novel about Japanese American resistance. They had gotten a grant from the National Park Service to do a series of graphic novels. The first one was about the Nisei veterans. Their second one, which is ours, is about the resistors. And the third one, which will be out, I believe, in May of this year, is called Those Who Helped Us, about allies. The Wing Luke's mission is all about bringing Asian Pacific American history to life through vivid storytelling. And so they knew back a few years ago, even before graphic novels really became a thing, that graphic novels would be the preferred medium. And I believe they've been right. Is there anything you have to add, Frank, about that? How we came to write the book?
They put out a call for proposals and hired
Right.
2 writers and 2 artists. And so it's projected for 1 year. It took us 4 years.
Yes.
Okay, I do want to read something that's quite moving that one of our audience members, Mizu Sugimura, hi, wrote, as the daughter of a Nisei teen who was imprisoned at Tule Lake at age 16 with the rest of her family, I've never been able to shake off the necessity she felt when I was as young as grade school to clarify when asked by fellow Nikkei what camp she had been placed to answer Tule Lake for segregation. Tule Lake was never mentioned without clarification, and Tule Lake's history was one of the first camps I later tried to pin down. So appreciate the efforts of Frank, Tamiko, and those Nisei whose stories they shared in We Hereby Refuse to share this important history. Thank you, Mizu, for that. And then we have a question, too, from Mike James, who says, tell us more about No and No.
We only have a limited time, Mike. I realized I skimmed over the answers to the question, 27, 28. Question 27, are you willing to volunteer for the armed services? People thought, or young men thought, if I answer yes to that, does that mean I'm enlisting in the Army right now by answering yes? And the Army recruiters couldn't answer the question. They weren't sure. So that was a flag. Question 28, are you willing to forswear any and all allegiance to the Emperor of Japan? If a Nisei answers, an American citizen, a Nisei answers yes to that, are you willing to forswear any allegiance to the Emperor of Japan, known or unknown? If I answer yes to that, does that mean I'm admitting that I was loyal to the Japanese emperor? And does that become then evidence against me for a firing squad, hard labor? No one knew what the future held. No one knew how the war was going to go, how long the war would last. And so, these were questions that had no answers for those who were being asked. That's the short answer, Mike, of no and no.
Other questions?
I want to read an answer, Nancy Bristow, who says that she's going to be teaching the book. If you go to curriculum.wingluke.org, there is a video posted with Tamiko and I and Ross Ishikawa talking about the creation of the graphic novel for educational purposes. And there will also be shortly a fully designed educator's guide with classroom lesson plans aligned to Common Core standards and a full list of resources for the research for students.
Is there a timeline up, Frank?
As well as an online interactive historical timeline with pop-ups that contain rich database links to a database of materials, all the original research materials we used in writing the story and the script for this graphic novel, so that it kind of makes it transparent for teachers to grab the primary resources and then show the students that we didn't make this stuff up, that and here's more you can study and use in your projects. So thank you, Nancy and others who contemplate teaching the book. I want to add that the book is hard to find right now. There's a few copies left at the bookshop on Vashon Island, if they're still there, and we're trying to get more. The book is being printed by a small publisher in Seattle, Chin Music Press. The third printing, and they do small press runs. And so the book has found its audience. It keeps going out of print. A third printing is arriving within weeks. We're hopeful. So you won't find it right now, but in a couple of weeks, maybe a month, you should be able to get it from your usual distribution channels and your local bookstores.
Can I pop in and say that Mukai Farm Garden has donated 10 copies, 2 places on Vashon Island, 1 to the Bookmobile, 3, I think, to McMurray Middle School, 3 to Vashon Island High School, and then the remaining to the bookstore to sell. So there are a couple. If you have kids in the school system, they could probably check one out, which is really awesome.
Yeah, thanks, Tina. There are a couple of other comments that people have made, and one from Martha Matsuda, going back to the no and no question. She points out that if the Issei had answered yes to the second question, it meant that they no longer had a country because they weren't allowed citizenship in the United States. And Eva Abram asked if the book is also available at the Wing, and the answer is yes, I imagine.
Yes, the Wing Luke has the only inventory in Seattle right now because they grabbed 1,000 copies from the second printing, so they're sitting on a big hoard right now.
Bruce Holman also piped in saying, excellent presentation, Tamiko and Frank, such an important topic at this time in our nation's trials and on this Remembrance Day. And I wanted to call Bruce out because of the really important role that he has played in documenting, along with others on Vashon Island, the Japanese American experience on Vashon Island, and he's really done an incredible body of work in that regard. Other questions? Okay.
I have a question. Frank, Tamiko, what do you think that we can do, or what do you think that young people can do to help reverberate this story? I'm assuming that when you were designing it and writing it, they said that a graphic novel was the best received. Is that because more young people read graphic novels? And how can we get the story to people who are not of Japanese American descent?
Well, I'll just jump in and say that, adults read graphic novels too. I mean, and if you look at Art Spiegelman's Mouse about the Holocaust, I mean, that's he wrote that for his peers, and it's very effective. Students they should just read all the books they can get a hold of. Just read widely, and share them with their teachers and school administrators. I don't want to get off on a tangent. I want to give Tamiko a chance to answer too. But right now in America, we're facing this divisive movement to start to ban books or to restrict books. We have this cynical attack on critical race theory, which began as a wedge strategy and is now gaining momentum. And so, Mouse has been attacked by a school board in Tennessee. And so there's a movement now to instill fear and to make educators afraid to teach the mere facts of history, much less encourage critical thinking. And educators like we've had here listening, I can't imagine the tightrope you have to walk in other states, like Tennessee and Florida, to just to teach history. And I think this is going to be growing as an issue here in America. And so the young people should simply let their school boards know how much they enjoy reading primary materials, graphic novels, and how much they want to hear, and that they're not afraid. I mean, that they're not vulnerable. They're not. They want to read widely and have access to all the materials.
I found that young people really have a very clear and firm sense of justice, right? That they know what's right and what's wrong. And if you lay things out for them quite clearly, as we tried to do in the graphic novel, then they usually respond quite positively. one way I think really to get involved is that, spreading of the history through whatever medium works for people, right? There's a fantastic podcast that Densho put out. Hannah Maruyama and her brother Noah did this amazing podcast. If you like podcasts, right? There are memoirs for those who like memoirs. There are many graphic novels now about this history. George Takei's is one. I really recommend Kiku Hughes's Displacement, though, for younger folks, especially for this generation. It's a really great read. It has some time travel involved, which is unexpected, but really quite powerful as well. I also encourage people to find out really what critical race theory is before they attack it. It's certainly something that I read in grad school, and when I saw what people were calling out as critical race theory, I was pretty surprised and shocked. As a lot of people have said, critical race theory, what people attack as critical race theory is really more complete accounts of American history. And that is what we've tried to do here with the graphic novel.
Excellent. We've had a flurry of questions as you spoke. One from Catherine Barrell. Can you enlighten us about how the Vashon residents responded as Japanese families sought to come back? Were the farms cared for during the internment? As I understand, some of the farms were on Bainbridge. Tamiko, you may have that information.
I have some of it. Yeah, I didn't know if you wanted to jump in, Rita, or Tina, but from what I understand, some of the farms were cared for. The Matsuda farm in particular had a Filipino caretaker named Matt Garcia. But I believe that there was a sheriff, and Bruce can also jump in. There was a sheriff who also ended up taking possession of the Matsuda land for a time before the Matsuda family got it back. And there were other farms that were not cared for during the incarceration. So not quite a similar situation as Bainbridge. And again, to the best of my knowledge, very few Vashon Japanese Americans came back to Vashon, again, unlike Bainbridge.
That's correct. I'm going to invite Bruce if he can put his mic on to also add. And while he's doing that, I will add a little bit more. So Bruce, please join us.
Sure, I'm here.
Okay, great.
Okay, great.
So,
Yeah.
Only about 30% of Japanese Americans returned to Vashon. And it was not a universal welcome to the Japanese who returned. In fact, 4 homes were torched before they even returned at the urging of a kind of a nativist group out of Burien who leafleted Vashon just as the war was winding down. Bruce, now you take over.
Yeah, sure. The sheriff took over or leased actually 12 different farms, and then failed to carry through with the lease. Actually tried to buy them for pennies on the dollars. They all refused. So it was not a pretty picture. And what Rita referred to, the Pearl Harbor League out of Enumclaw, Washington, had come to the island in November and December of 1944 and leafleted the island with the governor's campaign to not allow the Japanese to come back to the state of Washington. So the governor of Washington was leading a campaign to prevent the Japanese from coming back. And as a result of that, 3 young men actually burned 4 houses. In the most serious, 3 of the houses were abandoned. And so, but the one house that burned was the Miyoshi farm, and they had all of their equipment, all of their possessions, and the possessions and equipment of 2 other families. And so those 3 families totally lost everything in that fire. So it wasn't, Vashon was not as welcoming as Bainbridge, for sure.
Martha Matsuda says, Bruce, can you turn your video on? I'd love to see it.
I'm sorry, I think that's my fault. I don't think I can do it. I'm trying, Mary.
Okay. So there was a question about Japanese ownership of land from Eva, hi Eva. And she asks, I'm confused about Japanese Americans owning land. At one point, Japanese Americans were not allowed to own land. When did that change? Japanese Americans who were not citizens were not allowed to own land. That was the alien land laws. But if you were a citizen of America, you could not be forbidden from owning land. So that was the distinction that was made. Okay, I thought I saw a question from
Yeah, Mike James wanted to know about if the
Mike,
conditions
yes.
for 9066. Oh, go ahead, Rita.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, Mike James wanted to know if the conditions of 9066 still exist today, and I think Mike knows the answer to that because, of course, the impetus for the exclusion of minorities and the other never really dies, and must always be called out, as he says. The same elements of fear and ignorance of the other that open our book have been shown to be still present today. More so in the last 5 or 6 years than right now, but our book opens with the FBI knocking on the door to arrest our grandparents. It ends with ICE breaking down the door to deport immigrants, things we saw a couple years ago under the previous administration. Our book opens with, fear of an attack from the Pacific, and it was just 2 years ago we had a president who dog whistled China virus and Kung flu. And kind of that sanction that that he unleashed, I think that the nativism and fear is something we're still feeling today in the attacks on Asians on the street or in New York subways. That kind of fear, again, fear of the other, has been shown is always will be with us for a while. But Mike knows that.
There are a number of people who have recommended books for younger children and also for other audiences that describe internment, describes the experiences of the Nona boys. And I would invite you to look in the chat section and scroll through that if you're interested in getting those references. I do want to say how proud I am of the acclamation this book has received throughout America. Both of you have been on the circuit constantly. Frank, this is your 4th appearance today.
Yes, relentlessly self-promoting, Rita. Thank you.
Including just before this call,
Yes.
An interview with the Smithsonian Museum. So I'm very grateful that you told your story the way you did, and that it's been getting the reception that it has gotten throughout America. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Is there anything that Tamiko and Frank that you would like to leave our group with as we end our time here?
Tamiko?
I think one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately is just for people to think and look into their own local history and their own backyard. Certainly, I lived in Tacoma for a decade before I found out that we had this vibrant Japantown, and was shocked to find that out. I'd grown up with Japantowns in California, certainly knew the one in Seattle, but had no idea that there was one in Tacoma. And one of the things that Frank is really good at is really connecting the material in our book with the specific location of the folks that we're presenting to or with. And so I have tried to take that up a bit here to really connect what happened in the graphic novel with what happened on Vashon Island. And I don't know if that's something that's necessarily taught enough in the Vashon schools necessarily. I do know that the Vashon Heritage Museum, thanks to folks like Rita and Bruce, had an exhibit about Japanese Americans on Vashon, but I believe that was the first, if I'm not wrong, right? Maybe one of the first exhibits about it, to really know the history of their place as it connects to these larger events. Because we tend to live, I think, in ignorance, but due to a lot of our school curricula, thinking, oh, well, that was so long ago and it happened to someone else. And then history starts to feel very personal, right? When it's right in your own backyard, like it was here. So that's something that I would encourage everyone to do.
I just want to say I'm overwhelmed by everyone joining us today from Vashon. The attention that you're paying to the story, and really recognizing those 111 Japanese American residents who were evicted 80 years ago. So thank you for that. On a personal note, I want to just shout out to this has brought me back together with two of my former colleagues at Cairo News Radio. Bart Aronson just sent me a personal message to remind me that we worked together at Cairo in 1979. And Lori Reed Hennessy, of course, is joining us as well. So it's been very personally satisfying to reunite with my old colleagues. And you too, Rita. You too, dear. We work together in so many projects at King County. So this is wonderful.
It has been really wonderful to reconnect with both of you. And as we close, I do want to reiterate that, Tamiko, you were talking about how this history is one that people just sometimes don't want to think about. And I do feel that there have been a number of acts that have been undertaken by the government and by society that have really either explicitly or implicitly attempted to erase our histories and the histories of other people of color. And that is why we feel that Mukai Farm Garden is so important, because it's the last farm complex left in America. And that is of great national importance. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Tina, for your excellent technical support. And thank you everybody for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that Frank is gone, but Tamiko, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. That was really fantastic. And Rita, thank you so much for sort of managing it all.
My pleasure.
It was
so
lovely.
Nice to see everybody.
Nice to see everybody.
There were some Vashon folks that made me so happy.
Yeah, there was a lot of Vashon folks. I think Vashon folks really care about this history.
Yeah,
as they should, because it really is in our backyard.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, there's Frank. He's still there. Okay. I think
So
I'm going to.
We had over 100 people sign up for this event.
We did. We had about 120, I believe, and we at the top had about 85 people on, which are fantastic